So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, including me. Thank you, Kern Foundation, for this work. I'm excited about this larger project that you're doing and looking forward to the fruit that it will bring forth, and glad to be part of it and contribute in some way. I'm here this week with my husband, John, and there's one thing I wanted you to know about that. I met him for the first time just about 4 years ago, and on our first date, he told me that he loved to teach Reformed theology. Now, I had had a lot of dates, and I was 58 years old by that time, and no one had ever told me they loved to teach Reformed theology. So I looked up at God and my heart and said, oh dear, I'm in trouble now. So we married a few months later. We're doing our best to travel together as much as possible and join our lives in mission and work. And so I hope you'll get to know him too also tonight and tomorrow. So I was invited here to talk about church, entrepreneurship, and the common good of the city. The story I'm bringing to you is the story of how God has worked in New York City the last 24 years, but specifically in the last 10 years through Redeemer Presbyterian Church. In 1989, when Redeemer was started in New York, the Christians, if they could, had moved to the suburbs. Nonetheless, actually, surveys at that time estimated there were fewer than 1% of center city people in New York who were Christian. Nonetheless, the people of New York City had a huge influence on the world at large, running our major newspapers, financial institutions, corporations, Broadway, the arts, working at the UN. So who were these people? They certainly weren't Christ followers, and they were definitely cultivators of a secular worldview. So Redeemer's mission, very blatantly at the beginning, was to reach New York City with the gospel, to help unleash the transformative power of the gospel in a way that both saved souls, but also improved and impacted the culture of the city. During the first 10 years, by all accounts, God worked through Redeemer to draw in people like me who hadn't darkened the hallways of a church for years and years and years, if ever. So the saving souls part of that was starting to happen. And that story, if you read the foreword of Every Good Endeavor, I told a little bit of my story there. But what about the power of the gospel to change the culture and to enhance the flourishing? Tim Keller preaches from the pulpit then and now. The gospel changes everything, not just our hearts, but our relationships in community and the world around us. And that was a great foundation. But how does the gospel change the city in which we live and work? Actually, what is the gospel? So I'm really grateful to Gary for laying that out this morning. I think I spent the first 2 years of my ministry there going, so if I'm going to know how the gospel changes the city, I have to really be able to articulate what the gospel is. So I never did it as well as you laid it out for us this morning. How does transformation happen? I mean, it's a really big idea in business right now. Every business experience, Disneyland started it, I think, is supposed to transform you during the course of interacting with that business. So the secular world is experts on transformation, the experience of transformation. How does that compare with this kind of transformation that the gospel is supposed to produce in us and in our culture? And then I think even more significantly is transform from what to what. What is the A that we're at that's so bad, and what is the B that we want to get to that's so good? And that should be a discussion that we have all day tomorrow or at another whole conference. From my perspective, after becoming a Christian at Redeemer in the early 90s, I moved away, first to Luxembourg to start a company, and then to Silicon Valley, where I led 2 other high-tech startups, some of them with a significant mission to change the world with technology. I'm going to jump over some of the fun parts of that story just to say that in 2000, Redeemer invited me to move back to New York to help them start a ministry that would be more intentional on this impacting culture, gospel transformation culture piece of their mission. I had a blank sheet of paper and lots of room to experiment, so no budget, which is the perfect environment for entrepreneurship. Lots of freedom to experiment, low penalty for failure, great theological foundations, and lots of raw talent in our congregation. I often call the Center for Faith and Work an amazing R&D organization. We were just really able to try a lot of things, float a lot of balloons, and just see what worked, what stayed up there. We did not create programs to publish materials far and wide or create a franchise. We rarely recorded the talks of our speakers in the hopes that not recording them would make speakers more transparent and share their struggles more readily. We focus more on the theology itself than the actual program. So people always come to us and say, well, tell us how to start this fellows program, or tell us how to start this financial services vocation group. And I say, well, could we just start with the theology, please? The program, you can do any number of programs as long as your purpose and your mission is solid and is valid. In starting the ministry, to be perfectly honest, and I really resonated with what Chris said last night, personally, I really felt like I needed to see gospel transformation. I had little enough evidence of it in my own heart, and I wanted to see more of it in my own heart. I had little enough evidence of it in my own relationships and my own leadership, and so I wanted to create and lead in a way that would really embody a live, powerful gospel. And I certainly I'd seen as much evidence of change outside of the gospel as I'd ever seen with the gospel. So I wanted to see this. I just felt like, God, please bless this with evidence of the power of your gospel to create change. Now, I didn't share that with my pastor, but in my heart, I thought I want a laboratory where we can really build a whole group of people who've experienced the power of the gospel themselves. So every day, with every new class or every new group, I would challenge people to let the truth, love, and power of the gospel change something in their heart. And if it can change one thing, it can change anything, change lots of other things. What does that look like? How does it happen? We experimented with programs to equip and mobilize people for gospel transformation at work. And key to this was that culture would change through our work. God called us to work in some piece of the culture, and that was the area that we got to produce culture change. Now, some of us may be able to produce culture change in our after hours, but let's focus for a while on this primary calling of changing it in the work that we actually are doing every day. I also wanted to note, I think I use culture sometimes synonymously with the way you use economy. Not always, but they're highly overlapping terms. I also use the word society to try to look at all the various spheres of culture and how they play together, but most of the time I refer to gospel and culture. So we've piloted many different kinds of classes. They've eventually culminated in a 9-month intensive fellows program for 25 to 35-year-olds. We call it the Gotham Fellowship, which is a seminary-like boot camp for people who never intend to go to seminary. They don't need the degree, but they want the knowledge. And I hope you find it encouraging that the hunger for this level of theology has been huge. It was a bit of a risk on our part to say, will people actually choose to read 100 pages a week that they don't get credit for, of books like Augustine and Calvin and Luther and Murray, and I think we had a good Baptist theologian in there too. The Theology of Work or this History of Christian Theology. Does that ring a bell? Yes, thank you, Olson, in there. But we invited, we sought a class of 24 the first year. We got 50 people to apply. We charged them $2,300 to be part of it, and had to turn half the applicants away. And now we have a class of 40. We get about 90 applicants a year, and we've been running this for about 7 years. So it's been a very, very powerful affirmation of people's hunger for theology. But you can ask me more about that in the Q&A. I want to talk to you about our entrepreneurs activity. A little before Gotham, we started an entrepreneurship initiative in 2006. Now, I think you can imagine this was an extraordinarily hard sell. And actually, it sometimes still is. Every year or two, I feel like I have to jump in and defend this program as being something that doesn't need to be spun out as a separate 501c, but is still validly embodied within the church. So I want to give you some of the basic selling points that I use to pitch this to Tim Keller and the rest of the church, including the congregants. One is that Redeemer is extremely committed to church planting. Now, when I told Tim Keller that he was, in fact, an entrepreneur of churches, he sort of recoiled at that term, but I think he's getting used to it now. We have a church planting center. We have committed huge resources to train pastors to go out and start new churches, because we believe that the way the gospel will transform cities is through the establishment of new gospel-based churches. We have paid zero attention to the people in those churches, or the power of those people starting new organizations in the city that are gospel-centered, that can more fully develop a gospel ecosystem to change the city. So I pitched that what they really need is a gospel ecosystem starting center, or an entrepreneurship center, or an entrepreneurship program. I got a little bit of traction on that idea. Secondly, most of our faith and work programs were in fact focused on people inside existing organizations, helping them understand the God-given potential to be innovators and creators and contributors to those organizations. But our congregation is young. Most of those people were in starting positions or mid-level positions, and there's only so much impact they can have. So we thought, why not at the same time encourage entrepreneurs who, from day one and from the top down, build in entrepreneurial vision and values in their organization. So it's just another way to get new gospel-centered organizations out there in the city. Thirdly, I pitched that it was a very amazing and unique discipleship theology training venue. So we get not just the entrepreneurs, but there's this whole ecosystem of people around them, the judges, the coaches, the investors, that are brought into this, that are interested in entrepreneurship, so therefore they're available to get a little bit of training and teaching in theology. Fourthly, and this comes home even more with what you just spoke about, Jim. It seemed that our young people, who have come from the most privileged backgrounds in the world, have gone to the best educational institutions in the world, have the most opportunities in front of them, were all selecting careers in New York in finance and consulting. And those are great fields. That's fine. But were they really considering where value creation happens, or where they can uniquely be creating value, or where they might be called to create value? Or were they just selecting those careers because that's where the best and the brightest went after they graduated from college? So what could we do to change the incentives so that some of our congregation would actually consider creating something new from the start? So given the statistics out there, I think I can go back and push that one even harder. So perhaps we could fan a spark of entrepreneurship that would draw more talented people into that area. And third, I think as a church, as a Christian community, or finally, as a church and as a Christian community, I think we're a little bit late in the game of entrepreneurship. 15 years or so ago, business schools, if you went to their websites, everyone said, come to our business school and we will help you change the world. And the way they were going to do that was through social entrepreneurship, and that became very hot. There have been great books written about social entrepreneurship. Most of it is secular. Some of it is even very anti-faith. And it all is based on a good principle that if we take the best business ideas into nonprofit, we can really transform the way nonprofits work, which has got some validity to it, but I think the power of the gospel's got more to offer there. So let's join in that game and bring a whole different set of resources to bear on it. Since 2008, undergraduate schools have gotten on that bandwagon of entrepreneurship training, primarily because there were no jobs for their graduates, and they were going to go out of business pretty soon if they couldn't provide some grounding that was going to serve their students, their constituency, when they got out of college. So entrepreneurship is really growing inside the undergraduate world. I hope that they can create those opportunities for themselves. But the church has been absent in that. So how can we join in that game? Well, I think that I actually had another 5 or 6 reasons, and the reason that they let me start the Entrepreneurship Initiative was to shut me up so that I would stop doing all this selling. We've been running it for about 7 years. We launched it with a conference. We call it the EI Forum. Out of that came a steering committee of congregants willing to run this and put some skin into the game, and they started a business plan competition. The business competition basically promises an award to the best nonprofit, the best for-profit, and the best arts venture that is brought to the table. We give them a class on what is a gospel-centered venture, and we try to teach them that it's more than just their product. It's actually every way they think about running the organization, from how they hire, how they train, how they fire, how they develop their supply chain relationships, however you want to look at every single aspect of the business. And so we try to give a deep theological perspective to ground their business plan. Then they present, that we read their business plans, and I'm in the midst of doing that for this year's competition. And judges come in and select semifinalists, and then we go to the finalist stage, and they present, and the winners present at our next year's annual EI Forum. So they get exposure. Prior to launching this, I approached 2 investors and asked for $100,000 each to use as seed money for these ventures. And they felt it was an innovative enough idea that they were willing to invest in that. And so we were able to establish that we clearly weren't taking money from the offering plate to invest in these very, very high-risk things. So we had some good investor support for this. So we thought we'd award between $5,000 and $25,000 per venture. We visited business schools to see how they were running their competitions and gleaned as much best practices as we could from that. We rallied experienced business people in the church to support this as coaches, judges, and speakers. And I just want to talk about that a little bit. It's actually been difficult. Our church is young. The average age is about 32. So most of the Center for Faith and Work ministry is catered to that age group, and it's been difficult for us to engage the senior level person, even though they need the spiritual grounding and the theological grounding as much, if not more, than any of our young people. So I was excited to see so many of them respond to participating in the entrepreneurship program. As coaches, especially as judges, they were very engaged, have been very engaged. So it's caused me to describe this as sort of in terms of a marathon metaphor. If you're a running coach, sometimes you get your marathon runner, prospective runner, 10 months before the race starts, and you get to teach them how to run from the beginning to the end. And I think we get to do that with our Gotham Fellowship program. We really get 9 months to shape them and ground them and groom them. Others you get 2 months before the race. They haven't done nearly what they're supposed to do. They're in a panic, and they call the coach and they say, help, do something so that I can run this race. And others, more like our more senior executives, all you get to do is splash water on them as they run by. And so I'm glad for these little opportunities to splash water on some of the more senior executives. So we had good congregational support for launching the business plan competition. We've tried to be thoughtful and theological about every aspect of the EI, and I'm going to give you a couple examples. One is these 3 categories of winners: the for-profit, the non-for-profit, and the arts. The idea is to just drive home that point that God can work through any of these 3 callings, that all of these are valid ways to serve God. But it took at least 2 years to gain acceptance of that idea, even from those who are the closest in to supporting the entrepreneurship venture. The business people didn't see any value in the arts. I mean, sports maybe, but the arts? I mean, really. The nonprofits didn't even want to be in the same room with the business people. I mean, we should have 2 conferences, really. We don't have to be together, do we? And the poor arts people, well, the whole idea of a plan? So I think at this point, the entire church has a better idea of the theological concepts behind the valid callings in each of these 3 areas. We've accomplished some embodiment of that theological truth. Also, our ventures are intended to be ones that serve the world, not just the Christian community. Each year we get lots of proposals for ventures to, shall I say, exploit the Christian community, that want to use the Christian community market, want to create a product that, in fact, we get every member in our church to buy. So we've had a proposal at least every year for a Christian dating service, which might actually be valid, but that wasn't our goal with this, or Christian music companies, et cetera, et cetera. They're all able to participate in the training, but we do exclude them from winning because we're trying to make this point that it's valid for Christians to seek the peace and prosperity of the city. And I think it takes embodying it to get that across when there's so much prior thinking that it only matters what you do inside the church. Our entrants also have to be able to at least articulate how the gospel informs their venture. We'd like them to also be able to articulate the gospel, but how they don't have to put it on their cup or the back of their product or even in their core values, but they have to be able to articulate it to us that this is the way the gospel's changing how they market. This is the way the gospel's changing how they operate in some way. This is their hope for what God will do through this venture. We've judged the potential gospel impact not just on the need and the product to meet that need, but also on the viability, trying to reinforce the idea of God's concern that we steward our resources well. So driving home that theological concept. they have to be interested in growing spiritually and in theology. You always get the ones that just want the money. And so we've been very intentional in teaching. In one of our forums, we linked the passion of an entrepreneur, which every entrepreneur just loves to claim. I've got the passion to make this happen, and there's lots of books about the passion of the entrepreneur. Making that link to the passion of Christ is a little uncomfortable. And the root of the word comes from its usage in the passion of Christ. So we really explored that idea of, a whole life sacrifice for the good of others. And if that's not at the heart of your motivation, if the heart of your motivation is really to get rich or to serve yourself or a great exit strategy, then let's think more deeply about what God would have your passions to be. So we've had fun exploring that idea. Taking risks. What is our unique ability as Christians to take risk because our identity is in Christ? We should be able to handle failure better. As a matter of fact, when I first got to Redeemer, I taught a class on success and failure. Nobody wanted to teach this failure part. I knew tons of people who had failures, but nobody wanted to be the one to teach that part. Because we don't want our identity to be marred by a failure. But we should be a people who can get out there and say, God works. If we don't have failures, we will not have successes. And we talk a lot about hope. The difference between a hope based on naive optimism or presidential campaign speeches versus one based on a biblical story. And I think those have had lots of fruit, really pushing that theology into the experience of an entrepreneur. They also, finally, had to be willing to submit to a church community, the training, coaching, and at least listen to the advice of the people that we gathered to help them. So we're constantly, and I think Chris has run across this also in Detroit, we're constantly running across the tendency for an entrepreneur to be a person that, in fact, can't get along with anyone else, and that's why they want to be an entrepreneur. And to try to basically say, as Christians, we're accountable to others. Our entrepreneur doesn't get a free pass in accountability. And that's actually been a self-selection process on quite a number of the people who initially approach us, for better or for worse. So I'm going to be perfectly honest. The first year of our business plan competition, the entrants were embarrassing. We had 45 entrants. And the biggest benefit of the program was to convince some of them that they were deeply out of touch with reality. They desperately needed to hold on to their day job. We doled out our awards and our funding very carefully against very specified milestones and only ended up giving out a little bit of the money that we had thought we would give out that year. But since then, from 2008 to 2013, we've seed funded over 18 ventures, and a good number of them are still alive. I want to highlight one or two. Tegu, some of you may have run across it. It was started by the Hoey brothers. They make toys, wooden blocks that are magnetized, and I noticed in almost every toy catalog I received prior to Christmas, Tegu toy blocks were in it. So I'd say that's pretty darn good market penetration. When they came to us in 2008, it was barely an idea. One of the brothers had been doing mission work in Honduras for a significant period of time, and they wanted to create a venture that would provide jobs in Honduras. They wanted to use natural resources from that area. There wasn't much except for forests, so they wanted to do something with wood, and they just basically explored products until they came up with this magnetic block idea. When they came to us, we were able to provide seed money, some experience coaching, a little bit of visibility for having won Redeemer Presbyterian Church's Entrepreneurship of the Year award, which got them a little bit more funding. And right now they have a factory down there in Honduras. They have a significant workforce. They've done significant management training within that workforce. And it's, I know they've gotten additional funding. I don't think they're profitable yet, but they are on the road to some really wonderful impact. They're definitely the superstars of our entourage. On a more local level, our lawyers from our law group, who are all doing corporate law, wanted to do some law to help the poor in the city. They volunteered at a homeless center to do a legal clinic one Saturday and learned that there was a big need, especially in the area of real estate housing issues, that they could actually get ahead of homelessness if they could help defend the housing needs of some of these people. And so they entered our business plan competition and they won. And with the money, they were able to become a 501c3 and create a website and create a little bit of structure around it. One of our Gotham fellows, who was a lawyer, left her job and became the head of this legal clinic. So Open Hands now operates in 3 different locations in the city and channels lots of volunteers and has met a lot of housing needs. So that's just been fun because it's so supported from the, all aspects of the Redeemer community. Just to summarize a few others, we helped start 3 theater companies. 2 fell apart as soon as the lead person got a big acting role in another production. But 1 is still going, and it's producing new work. They're more on the playwright side of it, so that's been fun. We funded an arts organization called Arts and Minds, which works with Alzheimer patients and their caregivers, because art really does provide some transcendence in the lucidity of an Alzheimer's patient. We helped a health center in the poorest section of Staten Island operate until it was able to get approved by the government for the reimbursements that it needs to operate in, with people who can't pay. We helped start an aftercare home for women rescued from sex trafficking in New York City, which was really the first of its kind in New York City, and that's going very well. So you get the idea. Hundreds in our church have been involved, and many other churches, as well as the folks from Marketplace One, who came alongside us a couple years ago because they wanted to provide some funding to help us invite in other churches to learn about this. So they've been a wonderful partner. I'm reading through this year's entries now. My successor, who's now running the Center for Faith and Work, David Kim, will most certainly put his own stamp on this Entrepreneurs Initiative and how it works in the future. And we've got a long way to go to be a really quality incubator of quality ventures, but I think we've set the stage, both theologically and in practice. I'll be writing quite a bit about what we've learned about gospel entrepreneurship this year, trying to capture some of these lessons. And my hope is that other churches in other cities will see the potential of this idea. I love that it's church-based. I hope we can build a network of churches that supports entrepreneurs around the country. And I'm excited to partner with David and Chris and others that are doing some work like that in their communities. So in my remaining time, I'd like to talk about just some observations about doing this with a church and pastoral leadership during my admittedly only short period of time being a Christian, just 20 years, and I've only really been involved in 2 churches. So you can take this for what it's worth, but idea 1 is organizational structure inside the church matters in this area. I echo everything that Jeff said and Jerry said this morning about faith and work being an add-on and that being a problem, and they gave us some theology that makes it more central to the conversion and transformation experience. But my observation at Menlo Pres was that their organizational structure was also an obstacle, not just their theology. Their marketplace ministry was buried under, I think, adult ministries, and then under men's ministries under that, and then, who knows how many layers. I mean, there was no, it was just one in a cafeteria line of hundreds of things people could pay attention to if they were part of that church. So when I was in discussion to go to Redeemer, they offered to restructure the whole church. I was nervous about the stewardship of my time, if this was just going to be a little add-on. It had been organized into 12 or 13 departments, all reporting to the executive pastor, and they reorganized into 5 ministry fronts, and Faith and Work was one of those 5 ministry fronts. So the 5 were worship and evangelism, community formation, mercy and justice, church planting, and faith and work. So I want you to notice that 3.5 of those are facing outward. All the things that were related to the church inside were grouped, and there was a large group of things, community groups, children's ministries, all of that was grouped under community formation. And evangelism, church planning, faith and work, and mercy and justice really took priority in the organizational structure of the church. This had huge ramifications, both as how the staff viewed the mission of the church and how the congregation did. Just that we were structured that way, that it was the head of those 5 ministry fronts that sat together each week to talk about the strategy and operations of the church. And so if I were starting a new church that didn't have the big staff like Redeemer has, and I could afford 2 direct reports, I would have 1 facing inward and 1 facing outward. And the inward person would do all the community groups, all the worship, all those things that a church normally does, and the other, the peer in that organizational structure, would do outward and develop those 2 things as equal parts of the value and mission of the church. I sometimes get to sing that song to church planters. The second area, and I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir here, is in the area of pastor, leader, training, and development. I just wish we could flatten that very hierarchical organizational structure. It seems like the Reformation flattened everything else in culture. Governments and our businesses are much flatter, but churches still, our pastors still seem to need to hold on to that untouchable position, that sacred position. And I think that in my experience, that's produced a number of bad things. One, I actually think they hold their theology close as their value add to the church. And I would love you to encourage them to teach it, not just use it themselves to have good sermons, to actually share it and spread it around, because people actually want some of that same theology that you're giving them. They don't have experiences like I had in business to grow and be refined under the pressure of having a boss and having peers that push at you. And I think they go into a church position and they tend to stay there and not be under somebody else. And I wish that there were ways that they had to play in the sandbox with others that were more refining, because it I think affects their inability to play with a successful CEO or a successful principal or someone else who's at a peer level. Just seems to be unnerving. So I'm trying to get to the heart level of what is, I talk to the pastors of our church, my colleagues, often about this. What's in the heart underneath this? What's going on here? So I think that's a piece of it. And they really start thinking of themselves as the church. I have been in the role for many years at Redeemer of being one of the last editors for a lot of the communications that go out by the pastors. And I'm always correcting the language of writing to the people of our church saying, thank you for coming to our church thing, as opposed to thank you for helping create this wonderful thing that we all did as a church. There's this language that the rest of us are either the investors or the consumers, but not the church itself. And I think it when you see it in, once a page in every communication, it's just really deep. They're not aware of how much, especially if they're a church planner. I think they really then, like all entrepreneurs, you have far more identity stamp on your organization than you should when you're leading a church. So those are just, I'm sure there's many other negatives to that, but it's just, I think that's a serious problem. The other is I'd love them to learn other educational models in addition to talking from the pulpit, and I hope you guys are doing that. I did online management and leadership education as my last product company, and we worked with how do we create interactive experiences online? How do we create some simulated on-the-job training experiences online? Because learning can't really happen if it's just only something that you're doing if you hear it. And so our attempts to do these mobilizing ministries have really been a way to do discipleship alongside of doing, so that the learning experience is just more deeply ingrained. So I just love to see pastors equipped with more learning models, a better understanding of learning theory and process. And lastly, if they could embrace the idea of being a leader of leaders and training the trainer, I think they could really mobilize a lot more activity and mission than having to be the one guy that's leading the class or teaching the class. And John and I have both compared notes that in most of the churches we've been part of, it's really been hard to teach. That if the pastor's not teaching it, then it doesn't get taught. So how can we really, I don't think everybody can teach, but how can we really be missional about equipping our congregation to teach and lead in ways that are gospel-centered and are in line with the focus of the church? So just some observations that Greg asked me to make about this 10 years plus now of trying to build faith and work into the heart of Redeemer Presbyterian Church. So on that note, I think I'll stop because I really love to entertain questions if anyone's still awake. I'm really encouraged by this gathering here today, and also encouraged by what I've seen God do in New York at Redeemer. We talk about the way the gospel does transform in one model as it transforms us through a cycle of death, resurrection, and glory. You have to die to, when he's transforming your heart, you have to die to some idol in your heart or some desire in order to turn to God, follow God, and let God be God and work through you in order to see his glory. I think that happens in relationships. I'm not quite learning yet how to die to some of my desires in order for my marriage to flourish. I'm early stages of that. But I think even at the industry level or the corporation level or the business level, when the financial services industry fell apart in 2008, and 20% of our church worked in financial services, so a pretty high impact on our congregation. It was the first time any of those people really understood how their work mattered in the world. There was an extraordinary amount of destruction, but out of the ashes, we've seen almost everyone who works in that industry from our church rethink, why are they there? What's God calling them to there in that industry? What's the purpose of that industry? What went wrong? What is the thing that was broken? And how can we together work to building something that is stronger and more God-glorifying? So out of even that death, we're seeing little signs of God's work and God's resurrection. So God's not going to give up on our world. Let's be willing to walk into this messiness, and I thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.